Hello everyone, today we continue learning Python, and today I'll show you how we can create an Azure function using Python, and I'll introduce you to Azure. So let's start. But before we start that video, I recommend you subscribing to my Telegram channel. You will find lots of materials, modules, libraries, examples and tasks on Python in my Telegram channel. Also, I post all the announcements there, so if you want to understand what will happen to the channel in the near future, you can go here. And I respond to comments much faster than I do it on YouTube. So subscribe to my Telegram channel, link in the description down below. Well, first of all, let me explain what is Azure and why do we need it. And one remark is that if you know Azure and if you are familiar with Azure and Azure functions, that video is not for you, because I will just explain and give you like the overview of Azure and Azure functions. Okay, so what is Azure and why do we need it? Imagine that situation. You have a website and you need to post or publish that website so every customer or every user can see it, can work with it, can buy some products from you and so on. So you need to publish your website or any application. There are some ways or a lot of ways how we can do it. First of all, what you can do is buy your own server, and that is called on-premises. So what you do, you buy a computer or a lot of computers, because typically we have a lot of clients for our businesses and or for our websites, applications, servers, and so on. And one server is not enough. So you buy 5, let's imagine 5 servers, and by the way, they all should be powerful, because if you buy 5 low-end servers, that is not great for your computer or for your website, because still your customers will not have enough or your servers will not have enough power to handle all the requests from your customers. So you need to buy middle-end or high-end products for your business. Of course, it depends, but I think you understand what I mean. Then, that's called on-premises again. What you need to do next? Next, you need to create a room where you will store all of your servers. So, server room. Then you'll need to put electricity to every server. Then you need to install the OS to every server. Then you need to install Python. To install Python or any language that you run, install all the dependencies, make sure that everything works. You need to make sure that you don't have, or you have some fallback. So for example, if your town is blacked out, your servers still work because you have customers from other countries, from other cities and so on. So you need to make sure that you have some backup server that works somewhere else, so your customers, when you don't have the electricity, your customers can still visit your website, or else you just lose money. Okay, so you need to do all of these things. And there are lots of problems with on-premises, but a lot of companies still run it because on-premises has its own advantages. So the first advantage is that you control everything. So you have your own computer and you can do whatever you want with that computer. So actually whatever you want. You store your data inside of your company. So your company, if you for example work in a bank, your company can store credit cards, can store identities of your customers, and that information is secure because it's in your own data center or in your own server. But again, there are lots of problems with configuration of all of the servers, with their maintenance, and if you are a businessman, what you need to do is hire a lot of people who will work with these servers, who watch after these servers and so on. But that is called on-premises. A lot of companies still run it, and there is nothing wrong with it, but today we have clouds. So what is cloud? Of course we have hostings, but hostings are pretty similar. So hosting is when you typically rent or buy a server, and a company gives you the tools, so you have the server, but that server is inside of another company's data center. You can work with that server, but still you need to install all the dependencies and so on. Today we have clouds. So what is cloud? Cloud, it's Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, AWS, so Amazon Web Systems, and so on. These are the tools that help us to build our applications quickly and with some great services. So what is the idea of the cloud? The idea is that you build your application, but Microsoft, because we're talking about Azure, Microsoft provides all the servers, Microsoft maintains these servers, watches after these servers, and you just build your application and do not worry about the infrastructure of the servers. Of course, you will have to worry about some kind of infrastructure, but it's not the infrastructure of like the real metal, because you only worry about how you can build your cloud. And Azure provides some services. So for example, AI and machine learning out of the box. So you can build, train, and deploy your own ML models. You can, for example, detect faces, you can detect speech. So there are lots of additional services that Microsoft provides for you. So for example, if you want to create an app that will track your or will identify a user by its voice, then you can do it right here, because we have a model that is already trained and everything is alright with that. We have compute, so you can deploy virtual machines in which your apps will work. You have a lot of cool things, and today we'll talk about serverless computing, and you will see how easy it is to deploy an app in a minute. So there are lots of things, for example, containers, because again, as I said, typically we don't have one server. If you have 5 servers, what you need to do is make sure that your traffic is distributed across all of these servers. Because why do you need all of them is if you don't distribute traffic across all of them. So in Azure, we have, for example, web apps. Web app is simply when you put a Docker container or a code to your Azure, and your code just starts working. And for example, if you have 500 customers, you have one instance of a server running. But if you have 5 million customers, then you have a lot of servers running, so you can easily work with that, with your web applications, and do not worry about the infrastructure of the Azure data center. The next advantage of Azure is that it's highly secure. So probably your company is not as rich as Microsoft or Amazon if you are talking about AWS, or Google if you are talking about Google Cloud. And these companies provide security, which, of course, the security can be broken, but they try. They provide you the security that is better than a lot of than the security you write on your own, because there are lots of professionals in these companies, and they will just work on the security of Azure, of clouds, because there are lots of money in these things, and yeah, it's just highly secure. So again, I'm not a professional in Azure, I'm still learning it because it's an enormous service. Like, let's go to the all products, and as you can see, there are more than 200 products available, all of them, as you can see. There are a lot of products in Azure. But I think that we should learn functions, because function is a really simple topic to start our Azure journey with. Of course, you can learn VMs, but it's not fun. So what I'll do, I'll go to azure.microsoft.com, and then I'll need to register if you don't have a Microsoft account, and then I'll go to portal. So portal.azure.com. As you can see, it logs me in, and now we are in Azure. So portal.azure.com. And as you can see, that is Azure. So again, there are lots of cool things in Azure, like static apps that work on functions and they will scale automatically if you have a lot of users. Health bot for health companies, servers bus, but these things are very, very, very complicated. And again, I'm not a professional and I cannot tell you everything about them. But if you like Azure and if you want me to work on Azure in the future, then write it down in comments and leave a like, and I'll see that you like Azure, and we'll go on. So I'll explain a lot more about Azure and a lot more about all of these servers, because I'm very curious about Azure, and it's a lot of fun than just raw Python. So what I want to do now, we can go to search resources, services, and docs, and inside of here, as you can see, I have a lot of search requests, but let's go to function. So just search for function and go to function app. So what is function in Azure? Function, as you can see, I have one function in here, and you will not have that function if you have not created anything with Azure yet, but I'll explain everything to you. And again, it's just an overview, because function app and functions in Azure, it's a very big topic, despite of how how easy it is to understand them at first. So what is function? Function, it's a small piece of code that runs when a customer requests something or when some events happen. So for example, you go to a website and you request an API. So for example, request give me the first user in database or in table. What we do here, we call an HTTP trigger. So we just call an API like in a normal backend and front-end API connections. So we just call an HTTP trigger, and our function starts when we receive that request. Our function starts, handles that request, returns the result, or for example writes that result in database, in table, or does almost anything with that response. With again, there are lots of events and lots of bindings to functions, but I'll explain HTTP trigger today. So again, when we request something on our website, our function starts, it handles that request as we wanted to handle that request, then it returns the response or creates a new row in table or notificates us by our email or does almost anything. And then our function app stops because we don't have any additional requests. So again, we only work when we have what to work with. So for example, if you have 0 requests at Sunday because nobody wants to use your service at Sunday, then what happens? Your functions do not run, so you don't pay for that period of time. On hosting, when you rent a server, you pay for every second your server is rented. So for example, if you rent for 1 year, you pay every minute for that 1 year. And if you don't have customers on Saturday and Sunday, for example, you still pay for that period because you rent a server. You don't rent a time of your customers or requests of your customers or request handle time. What you pay for in functions is how long your function has been executing. So for example, if you have 0 requests, you don't pay for anything. Well, actually, I think you pay for a small amount of money for the storage because functions are code. So we store code inside of Azure, inside of Microsoft data centers. And I think if you store that code for 5 years, I'm not sure because I stored a lot of code, but I have not paid for that in functions. But I think if you store your code for long enough, you have to pay a little bit of money because that's a storage. But I'm not sure, and I have never paid, so maybe that's a lie from my side. So again, if you have 0 requests, you don't pay for anything. And forget about last 2 sentences I've just said. But if you have 500 requests, then you pay for every request, for every time span your request executed for. So for example, if your request starts at some point of time, you handle that request and you pay for the time you have been handling your request. I think that's clear. So again, you only pay for what you use. You only pay for your customers. And if you have 0 customers, you don't pay at all. If you have 5 million customers, then you pay for these 5 million customers for the time your request has been executing or has been handling. So for when you start a request and when you enter your request, the time spent between these 2 points is the time you pay for. I don't know if that's clear or not, but I think it is. And now let's create a function app and you understand what it does. So click on create, let's wait a little bit, and yeah, as you can see, create function app. So what we need to do here? Here we need to just set up our app, so I'll use Azure subscription 1, because still you need a subscription that you'll pay from. So for example, if you have Visual Studio Enterprise, then you can use Visual Studio Enterprise subscription. You can create your own subscriptions, for example, your personal one and the subscription for your business. But I'll just use Azure subscription 1, and I'll call resource group test YouTube. Resource group is just a logic grouping of your resources. So for example, if you have 2 projects running on Azure, you can group them in resource groups, and it will be easier for you to just manipulate with these with all the resources in this project. Okay, so as you can see, I have a lot of resource groups. These resource groups were by standard, Network Watcher, it's my own resource group, Twinko, Tempest, these are my own resource groups. These are just resource groups I created, and every resource group has its own services, its own resources. So let's go test YouTube. If you want to create new, you just provide the name and that's it. And then instance details, function app name. Function app name, it's the name of our function app. So what is the difference between Azure Function and Azure Function app? I'll show you in a minute, but let's just give YouTube test, like that, YouTube test Azure websites. You can put Docker container if you know about Docker, but I'll put code because it's just faster for us. Then let's select the runtime stack. So what is our runtime? It's Python, and we can choose 3.8, but my PyCharm project has what? Let's go to the terminal. Let's write py. As you can see, 3.7, and I think that it's better to use 3.7. If you have, of course, it's better to use 3.8 in 2021, but because my PyCharm project has 3.7, I don't want to create a new one, and because of that, I'll use 3.7. And then we need to choose a region. So what is a region in Azure? Microsoft has lots of data centers across the world, and regions show you where you want your application to be published. So for example, if you are from Brazil, you can choose Brazil South, and you have the low latency between your customer and your application. If you are from Japan, you can use Japan East, and your application will be stored in Japan East. But I'll choose West Europe, like that, and let's go to hosting. So hosting just shows you some hosting features. So the first one is storage. Why do we need storage? We need storage because we need to store our code somewhere, because in basics we choose runtime stack and we choose version, so we store Python code or Docker container, and we need that storage account just to store that code. I have 3 storage accounts, but I will create a new one. You can create a new right here. Then operating system will be Linux, because Windows is not available for me, and Linux I think is just better for any kinds of, for everything, okay? And then the plan indicates our plan. So we have 3 plans: consumption, functions premium, and app service plan. Consumption and serverless in parentheses. That means that we just use the basic plan of our functions, and for our test it's enough. Then we have app service plan and functions premium. There are some advantages of using every type of plan, but I'll just stick to consumption serverless. And if you want to, for example, handle a lot of requests, a lot of clients, if you want to make your maximum execution time longer, so the maximum execution time, what is that? Your function can execute for 5 minutes in consumption serverless plan, but if you want to, for some reason, execute your function for 10 minutes, then you can use functions premium plan. And again, I don't know everything about that, because it changes every time, every year, every 2 years, because it's a technology. It's not like Python where you have algorithms and so on. Python also changes, but I think you know what I mean. If you want to choose functions premium, then what you can do is go to Azure Functions Premium. Right here, let's go to Azure Functions Premium plan, and let's close that window, and you can read everything about it right here. So about billing, about eliminate cold starts, always ready instances, so your latency will be lower, private network connectivity if you want to connect to private networks. There are also advantages of using premium plan, functions premium. And I have watched Azure official YouTube channel, and the guy from Azure said that app service plan is not typically what you want to stick with, because app service plan is you pay like in bundle with your app, with your website, with your Azure app. That's it. So there are lots of different things about these 3 plans, but I'll just use consumption serverless because it's just for the test and for the overview of Azure functions. Then let's go to monitoring. Monitoring is just the monitoring of our application. Let's enable application insights, and I'll show you how easy it is to set up logs, applications, and so on. We can create new application inside, and I have test YouTube right here, so I'll just stick to that, test YouTube. Or you can create new. You have to create new, I think, because if you have never worked with functions, then you have to create new. Or if you have application inside, then you can choose that inside. But I will choose test YouTube that I have created before the video. Okay, next we have tags or tags. Tags are just the tags you can find in here. So tags for your applications. I think you know what I mean. Then let's go to review and create. And our function app is validated. We have everything in here, and let's just hit create. So as you can see, we initializing our deployment, submitting our deployment, and now we have that deployment. So that is not yet our function. That is just the deployment. So Azure now, what Microsoft does? Microsoft publishes our function app to its accounts or to its data centers. In our case, to West Europe data center, because I chose that. So as you can see, we create our storage account, we create service farms. That, as you can see, is okay. That is accepted because we have not created our storage account yet. It may take a while, depending on where you live and what data center you chose. As you can see, storage account is now created. Let's wait a little bit more. So again, Azure is a really big resource, and if you want me to continue working with Azure, because I'm very curious about that, then just write it down in the comments. So as you can see, now our deployment is complete. We receive a notification right here, but in next steps, we can go to resource. Let's go right here, and as you can see, that's our function app. That's it. As you can see, we have memory working set, function execution count, and milliseconds metrics in our Azure function app. And what should we do now? We can stop, refresh, or browse our application. Let's go to browse, or you can just open the URL right here. Let's go right here, and as you can see, on that URL, Azure says that your functions 3.0 app is up and running. That means that everything is great, and we have our Azure app instance running. So what do we do now? Now we need to add some code or some functions or Docker container, if you chose Docker containers, to our function app. So what is function app? Function app is a bundle of functions, of pieces of code that react to some events. So for example, timer event is when the time passes. For example, every 10 minutes you run your function, if you need to do that for some reason. Then you have HTTP trigger, and today we'll work with HTTP trigger. As you can see, there are lots of things in functions, so a lot of things right here, but let's go to functions. As you can see, we don't have anything in here, and it says that editing functions in Azure Portal is not supported for Linux consumption functions apps. It's not a problem because we'll edit it in my PyCharm IDE, so let's go to our browser and let's hit add. Now we'll add a function, and we have, let's wait, we have, if you use VS Code, then you can run that npm install command, or actually you need to run that npm install command in any editor, because it will install Azure Functions CLI to your computer. So you will be able to use func-init, func-new commands in your CMD or in your console. I have already, so what you need to do is just copy that and put it inside of your CMD. If you don't know how to open a CMD, just write CMD in here, or just use vner CMD. You open up that console, that command manager, and yeah, just write that function or that piece of code in npm install, and it will install Azure CLI for functions. Now what I need to do, I have already installed that CLI, and to create an Azure Functions project, I need to use func-init. Let's copy that, and let's go to my PyCharm. So now I'll open up a terminal and I'll write func-init. What we will do, it will first of all make me choose my runtime. So as you can see, we have .NET. .NET is a waited process, Node, Python, Java, PowerShell, or custom runtime. I will just use Python. And as you can see, found Python 3.7.4, writing like all the things we need. And let's close our console now. As you can see, now I have a lot of files and a lot of folders in my test project directory. So what are all of these? Well, first of all, let me just change my windows so you'll see it better, and like that. Okay, now I think everything's better. So we have how many? 5 files and 1 folder created. So VS Code folder, if you have worked with Visual Studio Code, you know that VS Code is just a configuration of Visual Studio Code. But since I'm in PyCharm, I don't need it and I can actually delete it. But if some programmers on my company work in VS Code, it's a great addition for them. So I will not delete it. Then we have funkignore. So funkignore is a file similar to gitignore, if you're familiar with gitignore, that will not bring any files or any resources listed in here when you deploy your functions to Azure. So for example, I don't need virtual environment in my Azure functions when I deploy them. Why? Because that virtual environment will be created by Azure itself, by when it like deploys my function app. Because of that, I put venv right here. If you don't need, for example, file called abc.py, because abc.py just runs your program or does something on your local computer that you don't need to run in functions app, what you can do is put abc.py right here. But actually, if you're familiar with the next file, which is called gitignore, I think that's pretty easy for you. So funkignore is for Azure deployments, but gitignore is for Git deployments. So as you can see, there are lots of things in here. So for example, env, venv-bug, and so on, pycache, node modules, app data, secrets data, a lot of things. And that gitignore file just shows you what, or just lists the resources that will be ignored when we push our commits to GitHub. So when we store our code, again, we don't need that venv file because we have requirements.txt. And venv file or venv folder contains all the requirements for our project. So as you can see, side packages, Python 3.7, pygame somehow is here, a lot of libraries in here, but you will not have all of these libraries, because if you start a new project with Azure Functions, these are just my libraries that are stored from the previous videos, from the previous projects, because it's a test project for my YouTube, like I use it all the time. So in gitignore we list all the things that we don't need to send to our GitHub, GitLab, or any Git repository that you're using, or any Git storage that you're using. Okay, so let's close gitignore. These two files are pretty similar. And then let's go to requirements.txt. So if you are familiar with Python, then you know that requirements.txt lists all the packages that we need to install. If we would not have requirements.txt, we will not be able to run our code. Why? Because all of these packages are installed inside of my venv. And that venv, so virtual environment of Python, is created inside of Azure. And if we don't know what libraries, what modules, what dependencies to install, then how we can run our projects properly? That's actually how it works. So as you can see now, it says do not include Azure Functions Worker, but we will not include anything here. What we have is Azure Functions. So when we deploy our project, Azure Functions will be installed on Azure by Azure itself. And actually that's it. So what we need to do what you need to do before you start working on that function app is make sure that everything is installed. Pip install /r or r flag. That means read the file, so read every library on specific line. So if, for example, we use requests in Python, then we can use requests right here. But let's remove that. Azure Functions is the only library that will be installed. Again, if you just put requirements.txt, then you'll want to install the library from PyPy, so from Python package manager, that is called requirements.txt. But if you put flag R, that means that you want to install all the libraries that are inside of requirements.txt file of your project. And let's run that program. Let's wait a little bit, and all the dependencies will be installed. Yes, as you can see, my requirement is already satisfied because I worked on that project before that video, and now everything's alright. So you just install Azure Functions, and now let's go to these two files, to JSON files, host.json and local settings.json. So what is host.json? Host.json, it's a file that applies global settings to all of the functions in our function app. So that is the main difference between function app and functions. Not host.json file, but function app contains a lot of functions. So for example, func1, func2, I don't know, HTTP trigger, func, timer trigger, func, and so on. So you have a lot of functions inside of your function app. And for example, if you are building an API, actually it's recommended that you don't have a lot of functions in one function app by Microsoft in their best practices docs. And if you want to deep dive in functions in Azure, then I'll link to the documentation of Azure functions in the description. So again, function app contains a lot of functions inside of it. And yeah, that's the main difference. Now what we will do, we'll write these functions. We'll actually write only one function because function app can contain one function, but it's just for the, so you know what is the difference between function app and functions in Azure. Now what I want to do, I want to explain what is host.json. Host.json, it's the file that has global settings for every function. So version of our function is 2.0. We have logging. Logging is from application insights. As you know, I have applied application insights when I have created my Azure Functions app. And because of that, it's right here. So sampling settings is enabled true, excluded types requests. Well, actually, there is one thing that we need to do. When we use func_init, we don't get the function app from Azure. We created a brand new project. And because of that, application insights is by default. So if you have turned off application insights in your Azure, then what you can do is just remove them right here. But actually, I think it's better to show you what application insights are and how easy it is to set up logging in Azure. Then we have extension bundle. So we have Microsoft Azure Functions and versions from 2.any to 3.0.0. That's it. So host.json file applies global settings to our Azure Functions. Then we have local settings.json. Is encrypted false, because why do we need encryption if we use localhost? Then we have values. What is the runtime of our functions? It's Python. And we use our development storage. Actually, I think that's it. We use development storage because, of course, it's local.settings.json, local settings of our Azure functions. And yeah, that's actually it. I will not change host.json and local settings.json today because it's a thing for another video if you want me to make videos on Azure. But now what I want to do is, let me just show you my whole screen like that, and let's create a new directory called first function. So what I like to do, I like to put underscore function in at the end of every function. Why? Because that shows that you really want to use function. Like, you don't want to just create a library with shared code between many functions, because you can have common library. Again, it's just a Python project with functions inside of common library, and as you can see, common, it's not a function, but first function, second function, third function. And of course, if you like have a function that does a specific job, for example, inserts a row, inserts a user in the data table, or saves the user, then it's not a great idea to call them first function, second function. You will need to make your names, your function names more descriptive. For example, save user function. But function suffix is very great addition from my point of view. Now let's create another file which is called init.py, like that. I will not add it to Git because I don't want to share my code to Git. But if you want me to share that code, just write it down. I don't want it to do it because my GitHub is, or my Git is connected to another repository. So I don't want to interfere with another repository, and because of that, I'll not save it to Git. Now, we created init.py, and let's create function.json. So function.json, it's a configuration of your first function, of one specific function. Host.json applies to every function in our function app, but function.json applies to only one function of the function. function JSON applies to the function the file is inside of. So for example, if you have, let's create another function, second function. What you do is, again, you'll create init.py and function.json right here. So let's do it. Init.py, and let's create a new file, function.json. And these two, like that function.json and that function.json, will contain specific settings for first and second function respectively. Let's delete that second function because we don't need it today, and let's head to function.json. Now what we need to do right here, we need to write some configuration for our function. And the first thing I want to do is use name. Not name, sorry, but what we need to do is use, I forgot how it called, script file. Yes, script file is init.py. It's init.py by default, but if you want to use, for example, main.py or, I don't know, main.py, myfile.py file for your function code, then you can specify it in script file. Okay, so we have script file right now, and let's create our bindings. So what are bindings? Bindings are the events that you call your functions when that event occurs. So for example, if you have an HTTP trigger, when somebody makes post, get, put, delete any request to that HTTP endpoint, you need to have it inside of bindings. If you have a binding on timer, you again need to have that binding inside of that array. Now I will create a simple HTTP endpoint. So first thing we need to pass is name, which will be a request. So what is name? Name is the variable that you pass inside of your function. So in our case, we're using HTTP trigger binding. And what we need to do is put like the name of the request that our user makes to a variable. And the name of that variable in our Python code right here, so for example, define main request, like that, will be request. If I want to put, for example, R, I don't recommend doing that because what is R? R is just a letter. R in here, what I need to do is rename that name to be R inside of my bindings. But I will go with request, and let's put request right here. Okay. Now we have request, and we need to use direction. So what is direction in HTTP trigger? Direction is where your request is headed, or where your response is headed, because we request from our function, from the outside world to our Azure function, and we go from outside world to function, so we go inside of the function, and direction is in. If you want to, I'll show you direction out in the later when we'll have response, but now it's just direction in because we make HTTP to come to our function, not out. And now let's create our type. So type is HTTP trigger, and type just shows you what is the type of your event. So what is the type of your binding? In our case, when HTTP trigger happens, so when our user requests that endpoint to do something, when we have a request to that endpoint, our function will run, and after that we'll execute some code, we'll make a response, we'll make a write to the table, we'll make anything that we want, and we'll close our function. That's how it works. In our case, it's HTTP trigger, so when we have HTTP request, we run our function. And then let's call auth level. So what is auth level? It just shows you what is the authentication level that you need to have to run that function. So for example, if you have function that should only be executed if your user is logged in, so if your user is authenticated, then you can put, actually I forgot, but I think it's authenticated, like that, something like that. Authenticated user inside of your auth level. But in our case, what I can do is put anonymous inside of here. So anonymous show that everybody can execute that function, and we don't need any token, any credentials to execute that function. Yeah, actually that's it. So we created our first binding. That is our first binding. And in our case, we'll run our function when we have HTTP trigger, we'll have direction in. So when we request something, we don't have any credentials or we have credentials, it doesn't matter. We don't need to have any credentials. And we'll put that request inside of request variable in Python language. Now let's go to init.py and let's have request right here. I'll import azure.functions as func. And I want to use annotation right here, func.http request. It's just an annotation, you can omit that, but it's better to use annotations in Python because they make your code to be more descriptive. So now we have a request from our user that is stored inside of that request variable. And there are also things that you can do with that request, get JSON, get body, and so on. But what I'll do is I'll use method. So I can, let's log our method, let's import logging from Python, and let's use logging.info. And a lot of you might say, why do you use just bare logging? Because it's better to use logging, get logger, then you can create some cool things, cool features with that logger. But actually, Azure Functions provides application insights. And when you use logging.info, logging.error, you do not just print your logs, but you directly insert them inside of application insights, inside of your logs in Azure. And that is a very cool feature because I don't need to make any loggers, I just can use bare logging module to write some code directly inside of Azure. And then what I want to do, if request.method equals get, so if our user gets something from our website, let's just put return. We can put just normal text, but I'll use function.http response like that, and let's put hello, just hello response. But if our method is not get or it's post, for example, yeah, let's put else or elif request.method equals post. Then what we can do is use request dot, and there are lots of things, but let's use just what we should use. Let's use just body. So get body, let's try, or get JSON. What I want to do, I want to just write the function. As you can see, it's just a Python code. Of course, Python code with Azure Functions Edition, but typically it's Python code. And what are we doing right here? Let's accept value error. I'll explain in a minute. Let me just do that. So what are we doing right here? When our user makes a request to our first function, we show or we scan all the bindings and we see, okay, we have HTTP trigger. We need to pass a request inside of that init function. We pass it right here. So that is a request from our user. I just log that request to Azure just to show how logging works. And then if the request method is get, I return HTTP response hello. Again, you can just return string, but it's better to use HTTP response because in the future we'll have JSON, status codes, and so on. Else if our request method is post, what are we doing right here? We use request.getJSON. So getJSON just is similar to getBody. GetBody is the body of your request, but getJSON gets the JSON of your request. Yeah, but it tries to make Python object from the JSON. So it's similar to JSON tabs, but I think you understand what does that mean. It's self-descriptive. And what I want to do here is name equals, and let's get name. Let's accept not only value error, but key error right here, because value error can be raised in getJSON function or getJSON method, because getJSON, JSON loads, it just loads our body, and if user provides XML, provides HTML, or provides just wrong JSON, then we'll raise value error. I need to accept it right here, and key error may be raised right here, because we return a dictionary, typically a dictionary, and if we have an error, then we'll just put key error right here. And let's return another HTTP response, so function.http response, wrong JSON, like that. And if we have our name, what I'll do is I'll return function dot, it's better to do it right here, function HTTP response, from what? From hello, let's put a string right here, hello, comma, and name, like that. So I directly, if you don't know about f-strings in Python, I directly insert the value to my string. And that's it. So I get the name of my user from the request body and I insert it inside of the string and I return it as function response. But there is one problem. When we use return, we still need to put configuration inside of our function.json because the only binding we have now is to in, so request binding, HTTP trigger binding. But what we need to do next is use HTTP out or response binding, some kind of like that. So what we need to do right here, I want to make an HTTP binding, but it's the settings and the values are different. So what is we have direction right here, which is out because we sent the response from Azure Functions to outside world. Then we have type, which is not HTTP trigger, but just HTTP, because we don't have any trigger on our user side. We just send the response, so HTTP. And the one thing that we need to do is actually, how to say it, we need to show what is the return, what is the function or what is the value that we need to return to our user. In our case, it's name. So name, but what we want to return? We actually want to return what is returned. So what is returned in a return clause in Python. But how we can show it to Azure Functions? Well, actually, we can put name and then $return. So that means that whenever we have return inside of main function in Azure or in our Python code, we return that as HTTP response to our user to outer world. And that's it. And again, there is one problem. If our method is not get or post, we return nothing right here. And that may lead to some serious problems with Azure Functions. And because of that, what I want to do is use methods in our HTTP request, so allowed methods. And let's put an array of get and post right here. So methods in HTTP trigger show what methods are allowed in your function. Okay, and then what I can actually do is return a leaf, because if our method is not get, it's post, because Azure will not allow any other methods to be on in our function, because it will just show method not allowed 5 or 4 error in our browser. Okay, so now we only have get and post methods, and if our user wants to get information, we send hello. But if our user wants to post information, we send hello and the name of the user. Now let's go to our terminal and I'll put function.start command in here. Let's run it. As you can see, found Python version 3.7.4, Azure Functions core tool starts, and yeah, everything's alright right now. Yes, you can see my screen. And first function, as you can see, the only methods that are allowed are get and post. Let's go to that function, to that API endpoint on our local host, because we develop our functions. And as you can see, hello, because we make HTTP GET request. Let me open up my Postman. So if you are not familiar with Postman, Postman is an app that helps you to make requests, to create and debug APIs, and just works perfectly with any API in any programming language. Let's copy that. Let's copy that string, so that URL, and let's go to Postman. So now Postman. Yeah, it's loading, but it's loading. Let's go to my workspace and let's put another request. So there are lots of things in here like API, environments, and so on, but let's put another request. I'll just press not plus, but plus in here. Yeah, now it's still loading, but it's a program, whatever. Let's put localhost inside of here, and I'll make get request right here. So there are lots of things like monitors, mock servers, and so on. Okay, let's just send our request, and as you can see, we get hello, because we get our information from our function. But if I use post, wrong JSON. Why? Because we don't provide any JSON inside of here. Let's put JSON, and let's put name, Andrew. Let's run it again, and as you can see, hello Andrew. Because now we have valid JSON, and as you can see, we have a lot of logs. We have our own logs when we put our request method. So let's do like request method, and let's put our request method inside of here. Request method, like that, because get post, it's not descriptive at all. So now everything is alright. Well, request method is neither descriptive, but whatever again. Now everything's alright. And at the beginning of our lesson, I said that I will show you how to run Azure functions in Azure with a little bit of code. So we wrote our little bit of code, and what we need to do now is use Azure function, Azure CLI to deploy these functions. Well, actually you can use func new to create a new function. Let's try it, func new, and let's wait a little bit. It will ask for the name of the function, I think. Let's wait. Okay, it does nothing because it's a long. First of all, I record, then my computer is not that great, and yeah, you can use func new, but I like to create functions on my own because it trains you, and you make functions a lot easier in the future than just using func new. Okay, then we can start our project, so func start, and we can deploy our project to our Azure application, to that application on real Azure. Let's put function Azure function app publish YouTube test, or any name of your function app in here. Let's run it. If you are just created or installed CLI of Azure, then you open up your browser, or Azure you open up your browser, and you need to log into your Azure account. But now I am logged in my Azure account, and now let's just wait until our function app is published to Azure. So let's wait, get inside publishing info. So as you can see, it does some work. Create an archive for current directory. I will not uploading files, remote build in progress, please wait. So it builds our function app inside of Azure. And now what we'll do is we'll just go to Azure, and we'll see like our app in the real internet, in the real environment, when we can use it, where we can send it to our friends, and so on. So there are lots of things happening, and yeah, a lot of things. Let's wait. There are some warnings. Outdated version of Python detected. Well, yes, because 3.7.9 I use it in my project, and yeah, that's just it. It's better to create Python 3.8, but I created that project a long time ago, and because of that it's 3.7. So as you can see, remote build succeeded. Everything's alright right now, syncing triggers. Let's wait a little bit, and everything is great. We have invoker URL, so we have our first function. I will not go right here right now, but I will go to my Azure and I'll refresh my Azure page. Nothing here yet. Let's refresh again, and now as you can see, we have our first function. Let's go to that function. So that first function is the real code. We can go to code plus test, and it's the real code of our Azure function. You'll see it right now. As you can see, that's our real code. And you can refresh it, you can go to test run. Let's go to test run, and as you can see, we have post and get methods right here because we allow these methods. Now let's just use get, so let's run our Azure function. It will open up logs, but I don't need it right now. And as you can see, hello, everything's alright. If I use post, let's put Andrew, for example, but not as body, but as name key. Let's run it, and in output, as you can see, hello Andrey. That's very great, but that's not everything that is happening in functions. First of all, the first million use of functions is free. So if you have 10,000 customers, then you can basically work with Azure for free if you're only working on functions. But then you only pay a little bit of money for your function. It of course depends on how much your function, what is the time span of your function, how long it's executing, and so on. But typically you pay a little bit of money for functions because you only use them when you have requests. So now I have our first function, and what I want to do is go to overview, and let's go to that URL. You see that function 3.0 app is working, but if I want to really use or invoke my function using its API, let's go to API and first function. Like that, let's run it, and as you can see, because our browser makes GET request by default, as you can see, hello is right here. So now we have the real Azure function inside of the real environment. That's great. Of course, there are lots of things that you need to configure, like function execution time will update in a minute. You'll see like the real logs. We can go to monitoring logs and you'll see that we have our logging right here. So yeah, we have to make queries, but let's just, how we can close it? Let's close it right here. Queries history, let's go to requests. And as you can see, we already have tables, we already have application insights right here. Let's just get all the requests. So requests, I think it's like that. Actually, it's Microsoft specific language and I don't know it yet. Let's just go to queries, alerts, response time trend. Well, as you can see, requests, then that strange thing, but where summarize render time chart. It will just render our, like the real chart. Let's wait a little bit. As you can see, of course, we only have one, we only used that function once, but if I go to API first function, oh, sorry, let's go again right here. API first function. Let's invoke that URL again and again and again and again and again. Let's rerun our query. So let's run it again. And now, as you can see, we have like the real chart. And the chart, the chart falls down. Why? Because when we started our functions, we just started a new instance. So we started them from scratch. But then our functions, I made a lot of requests, like 5 or 4 requests, and our functions app worked during that time. So we did not restart it. It just worked for all of that time. And that's actually great. So yeah, these are our logs. So we can simply with the included alert request create, or if you know that Microsoft language, I want to learn it, but it's really unfamiliar for me. Then you can just easily create graphs, and yeah, that's just actually great. So these are Azure functions, overview of Azure functions, and yeah, tell me what you think about that. Tell me how or as you can see, function execution count, we executed our function 3 times. Yeah, 3 times because test executions are not counted in here because it's a test. It's just a test. So these are Azure functions. You can stop, restart your function instance, function app instance, and that's actually great. Thanks everybody for watching and good luck.